They had 8 to 15 inches of rain across eastern Montana in May.
I don't know how many thousands and thousands of sandbags we put up, and we went about defending our community from the river.
It was a massive undertaking, but so appreciated by the residents who lived in that area.
It was hard. It was hard.
I think the biggest thing is people will step up and help if you need them.
"2011 was the year of the billion-dollar disaster, recording more disasters in 12 months than for the entire decade that made up the 1980s. One of those billion-dollar disasters was the Great Flood of 2011, which saw the Missouri River swell to historic heights, stretching far beyond its banks, flooding homes and businesses, and changing the local landscape permanently. Thanks for joining us for this special presentation, The Great Flood of 2011, 10 years later. I'm Chief Meteorologist Kat Taylor. Tonight, the Siouxland News First Look weather team is taking a look back on the flood of 2011 and how the tri-state region rebuilt after that devastating summer. Before we talk about the flood itself, we need to dive into what led to it. Believe it or not, the stage was set in the summer before, in 2010, with 20 inches of rainfall in Siouxland. That winter also brought above normal precipitation as well. But as the National Weather Service hydrologist Michael Gillespie describes, further north, more water was headed into a river system that was already flooding downstream.
We were just starting to see the snow melt in the northern Rockies. They had been sitting at about 120, 130% of normal snowpack heading into late May. And just about the time that snowpack started to melt off, basically the eastern half of Montana in the plains saw about a year's worth of precipitation in 3 weeks. And all of that water over that large area was coming into the Missouri River system at the same time that snow melt was coming off the northern Rockies. So that's when things really started to get crazy.
And all that water had to go somewhere. Unfortunately, the 6 major dams and reservoirs along the Missouri River between Montana and Siouxland were at 100% capacity. To compensate the excess water, the Army Corps of Engineers had a decision to make. And on that May 29, 2011, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sent out a warning that caught nearly everyone off guard. Devastation. That's how many of the residents in Siouxland described that summer. Communities up and down the Missouri saw record amounts of water inundate everything in its path. To help break down the numbers, we're joined now by Siouxland News' Sunrise meteorologist Katie Nicolau.
The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers were facing an impossible task in May of 2011, opening up the Gavins Point Dam and releasing unheard of amounts of water down the Missouri River. Meteorologist Vivian Rennie and I sat down with a water resource engineer from the Corps to reflect on one of the worst summers in Siouxland.
The first thing is we identified where we thought the flooding would take or would be and how long it would take to get there and how long it would last.
Once that was determined, the Army Corps of Engineers began to take action, starting with reducing the existing water levels before the floodwaters arrived.
We began releasing from our projects as early as the middle of March.
At its peak in July, the Gavins Point Dam released a record 160,000 cubic feet of water per second. With flooding guaranteed, they sounded the alarm, sending warnings to communities up and down the Missouri.
As I recall, we had probably a week, maybe 2 to prepare. We actually had time enough to build large berms down West 3rd Street to try and protect the west side of town.
The Army Corps of Engineers did more than just issue advanced warnings. They also provided millions of flood fighting supplies that were then deployed by the National Guard and community volunteers.
The Corps of Engineers nationally has a stockpile of flood fight materials, and those include pumps to pump water out of areas, empty sandbags not full of sand, millions of them. And then we have other types of what we call rapid deployable flood barriers, HESCO baskets, Porta-Dam, which is just a tarp over a steel frame. And we used all of those things in 2011.
Beyond physically reinforcing communities, the Corps also set up a joint information center for the public to call into to have their flood questions answered.
Every day at 5 o'clock, every day, Monday through Sunday, we held a conference call that had people on it from Montana to St. Louis.
After everything was in place, the Corps continued to monitor the situation, preparing for the water that was on the way.
We are really in a flood evacuation, flood control mode. And that is our main and really only focus, because it is a life safety priority, which is the Corps' only priority, is life safety.
With help from the Corps, it was time for communities and their leaders to face the flood.
He's a familiar face in local emergency management, handling many disasters in Woodbury County, but the flood of 2011 may have been the most unpredictable. Gary Brown is the director of Woodbury County Emergency Services. Around Memorial Day in 2011, Brown got word of the impending floodwaters, leaving him and his team just a few days to prepare before the river began rising.
Fortunately, it was a slow-rolling disaster. I mean, we didn't have a dam break and all of a sudden flood. We had time to kind of walk into it, which really helped a lot.
The information coming in was constantly changing and evolving, sometimes just every few hours. But as the waters began rising, one of their biggest worries was the city's utilities that ran under the river, like sewer and water pipes, and if they could stand up to the fast-moving water.
And then we had a whole contingency plan in place. What if one of those pipelines that's transporting petroleum products or whatever under the river ruptures? Now we've got an environmental disaster to go with it.
Thankfully, no major problems developed, proving the underground infrastructure could withstand the disaster. Brown will be retiring as director of Woodbury County Emergency Services this summer. To see more from our interview with Gary Brown, visit SiouxlandNews.com. With just a few days warning before the waters began to rise, residents along the riverbanks in the tri-state jumped into action.
Suddenly, this happened. So it was shocking. You had to scramble into action.
Coming up next, hear from a few of those residents about how they prepared for the inevitable. And one of our own looks back at his personal experience with the flood. Stay with us.
I can't believe this is happening. And what are we going to do? Is the center going to be gone?
Off the bat, just because of where we're at, it was that constant, we're going to have to do something.
It was surreal because as we drive into our community, it's like an army's been mobilized.
I came to work one morning and Colonel Christensen pulled me out of a meeting, told me, "You're my guy." That's how much notice. And about 4 hours later, helicopters were landing.
Warnings of impending high water echoed through communities across Siouxland. The Army Corps of Engineers sent out the first flood alert over Memorial Weekend and began increasing releases at the Gavins Point Dam. Hundreds of Siouxlanders along the Missouri and other rivers in Siouxland had very little time to prepare, and they had to save what they could of their homes. Meteorologist Vivian Rennie joins us to introduce us to several area residents and their journey through the floodwaters.
Siouxlanders who had built their lives along the river were suddenly faced with months of high waters and seemingly never-ending danger to the communities, businesses, and landscapes they held so dear. I sat down with just a few of those impacted by the summer to learn more about a summer that they will never forget.
Suddenly, this happened. So it was shocking. You had to scramble into action.
Warnings alerted communities the length of the Missouri, and Siouxlanders jumped into action to hold back the water.
Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of sandbags we put up, and we went about defending our community from the river.
At first it was surreal. We had helicopters flying over, we had National Guard members here, the residents were all scrambling.
It was hard.
Levees went up fast with the help of volunteers from all across Siouxland.
People just pitched in and got those in record time.
It was no problem finding volunteers. We had people signing up and we had people just showing up.
Sandbags surrounded buildings and roads, but some areas became the front line of defense against the rising water.
Pretty much right across this path, all the way down to hole 17. The water was right up, probably halfway down this hill.
With much of Dakota Dunes Country Club area evacuated, it became a swarm of activity.
This went from a country club to kind of a center for rapid response.
Along the riverfront, the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center was also at risk.
You have this as they say, stew pot of emotions that I can't believe this is happening. And what are we going to do? Is the center going to be gone?
Levees were guarded and checked 24 hours a day for weeks.
I was leaving my house at 4 in the morning and I was getting home about 10 at night. Start all over again.
Every hour, basically on the hour, we'd walk the levees looking for like cracks or if it was starting to settle and leakage, and it was just our job.
As the floodwaters continued to rise, it left devastation on every bank.
We were in, are we gonna, run for your life mode? And then it was tough. It's getting back on your feet and plan, how are we gonna do this?
K-Mate 14, your hometown news starts now.
National Guard Black Hawk helicopters have arrived on the scene.
As waters began to rise, up in the sky was a sight not seen in Siouxland. More than a dozen military helicopters from bases across the Midwest were landing at an Iowa Air National Guard base. A big change from the large refueling planes normally seen flying the skies above the metro. Over Memorial Weekend 2011, the 185th Air Refueling Wing was handed a new mission, helping their neighbors in their own backyard.
I came to work one morning and Colonel Christensen pulled me out of a meeting, told me, "You're my guy." That's how much notice. And about 4 hours later, helicopters were landing.
Master Sergeant Dave Henson was the only airman with helicopter experience on the base in 2011, making him the point man for helicopter operations. These choppers not only helped monitor the flood from the sky, but assisted in sandbagging operations too.
The helicopter has a long line slung underneath it, so they could just pull into a hover, hook up with sandbags, and take them to wherever they need to plug holes. We had South Dakota helicopters here, Iowa, and then Minnesota helicopters here helping.
These helicopters haven't been seen in Siouxland since the summer of 2011. To hear more from the 185th, you can watch our extended story on SiouxlandNews.com. There is one member of the Siouxland News team that was here in 2011. Siouxland News at Sunrise anchor Jacob Heller was a reporter back then. He takes a look at his experience covering months of flooding up and down the banks of the Missouri.
For me, the flood started on May 29th. It was a Sunday, my day off. My boss called me into work, said there was a flood coming. It seemed like pandemonium, people rushing around, filling sandbags. Nobody had any idea how bad this was going to get.
We think it's going to come through our backyard, but in the front yard, our middle circle thing is filled up a couple feet of water.
Then there were evacuations for folks living in parts of Dakota Dunes, and levees were popping up. One was right here. It cut through this neighborhood along Pinehurst Trail.
It's go, 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 you know?
There were hundreds of trucks hauling dirt.
We do push hard almost all the time, 12-hour days, but I mean, they're asking us to put in 16, even more hours sometimes for this project.
We were lucky. We weren't evacuated out of our Siouxland News studios. We were K-Meg 14, your hometown news at the time. There wasn't much else here in the Gold Circle back then, so this is where the National Guard set up shop. You'd have to show an ID to get into the dunes. Most people weren't allowed past the levees, evacuated in some cases until September. It was a challenge trying to come up with a new way to tell a similar story every day. It was a once-in-a-lifetime flood, yeah, but it went on for months. In July, I met divers reinforcing the levee, spending 8 hours a day in that murky water. Eventually, we started seeing people and businesses try to get back to normal. When a Vegas casino resort in Sloan had to use amphibious vehicles called ducks to get people in, the place was surrounded by water. I was on one of those first trips. From there, it's just a quick trip up and over the levee, where Winnevegas Casino was still high and dry. The flooding affected fishing along the Missouri and South Sioux. The banks looked more like a desert than a beach.
Before we got the flooding problem over here in this river, I used to catch bigger fish. Right now, I use a bunch of small ones.
We're going to have a party when this is all done. I told the neighbor yesterday, we're going to have a lot of stories to tell when this is over.
In September, we started telling happier stories. Folks evacuated from Dakota Dunes and neighborhoods all along the Missouri, moving back into their homes.
Who would ever think you'd look forward to mowing your own yard, but that's actually where we're at. You start the simpler things in life you appreciate more now.
I spent about 3 months that summer telling nothing but stories about the flooding. I'm never going to forget 2011, and it's a summer I'm sure no one who lives along the Missouri River wants to live through again.
In many places along the Missouri, there are still remnants of the flood 10 years ago. I took a trip around the tri-state with Siouxland News photographer Katie Koppel to see some of those places for myself. The Missouri River runs over 2,300 miles from the Rocky Mountains of western Montana to the Mississippi River north of St. Louis, Missouri, as it winds its way through the central U.S. It makes a stop right here in South Dakota at the Gavins Point Dam. In 2011, this dam was releasing a record amount of water, over 160,000 cubic feet per second. That's more than double its previous record set in 1997. Here at Ponca State Park, you can see the Missouri where it touches all three Siouxland states. In 2011, there was water as far as you could see. The water level now in 2021 is about 20 feet down from here at ground level. I'm 5'6", and back in 2011, after the waters receded, this is all that was left, a tree stump showing how high the water level got. Much of South Sioux City sits on the low bank of the Missouri. Here at the Dybel Soccer Complex, dozens of fields were underwater, and once the river returned to its bank, these fields were covered in sand and debris. When you see images from the flood here in Sioux City, one of the most eye-catching pictures is of this right here. The gazebo overlooking the Missouri was only visible by its top in 2011. For neighborhoods in North Sioux City and Dakota Dunes along both the Missouri and the Big Sioux rivers, dozens of homes were flooded. The water reached levels high enough that boats could travel these streets. Now, 10 years later, these communities have rebuilt and grown even stronger before the Great Flood of 2011. Once the floodwaters arrived, they stayed around for months. Coming up after the break, we dig into why it took so long for the flooding to recede and how local residents and businesses began the daunting task of cleaning up. We'll be right back. The floodwaters in the Missouri peaked on July 21st that year, but the recession took much longer than most expected. Meteorologist Katie Nicolau joins us with more on why it stuck around.
Well, this was a long-lived flood event. Even after the peak in July, floodwaters remained in Siouxland for weeks, slowly regressing through the remainder of July and for most of August. Much like the cause of the flood, everything came together just so to keep the water around for a long time.
It was a matter of months. Yeah, it took a while.
To get floodwaters to go down, you usually look for three natural factors. One is that the water flows downstream out of your area, or it absorbs into the soil, or evaporates into the air. The problem is that in 2011, none of those were options. We had more water coming in than we had going out. The soil was already saturated, and it was so humid that we couldn't get the water to evaporate.
They have to slowly let that water out upstream. They have to kind of pace it out as time goes on, so it took several months.
Once the floodwaters subsided, a new problem was uncovered: the massive amount of debris that was left behind by the floods.
The amount of silt that was on the soccer fields alone was 200,000 cubic yards. That's right at 10,000 side dump loads.
Anytime you look along the banks of the Missouri River, you'll notice that there are still piles of sand everywhere. But that's completely normal. The river rises and falls every year and leaves behind sediment when it decreases. The difference in 2011 was that all of this sand was pushed up onto homes and roads and businesses, and because of how slowly the water retreated, it took months to clear out.
And once the water returned to its banks, the cleanup process began. Meteorologist Vivian Rennie continues her story with local residents to see how they took on the daunting task.
Well, Kat, those same Siouxlanders who were faced with the high rising waters battled a new challenge as the water receded. From sandbags to groundwater, for some, the cleanup was just as challenging as the initial flood.
In my particular case, I think I estimated 15,000 sandbags around the back of my yard. Well, now the flood is diminishing. You have to do something with the 15,000 sandbags, and so we went through the cleanup process.
Cleaning up sandbags became the focus for many, from homeowners to volunteers and those who work alongside the river.
We had to move a lot of levees. We had to move dirt back to North Sioux City, replace that.
Along the riverfront, the levees that had helped keep the water out were now blocking streets, damaging golf courses, and now they had to go.
We had constructed 2 levees that had to be removed.
We had a lot of temporary levees up. We had some roads we had to repair. We had some levees we had to take down and restructure in other spots.
Damage from floodwaters, mitigation efforts, and groundwater affected everyone along the river. At the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center in Sioux City and the YMCA in South Sioux City, floodwaters were kept out of the buildings, but the parking lots weren't as lucky.
The damage that was done, the parking lot was just ravaged.
The facility stayed clear of water. It just got all around and rerouted into like the parking lot.
So many dead trees. That was, to me, kind of the symbol of the flood.
Just like when the water rose, volunteers stepped up to clean up what the mighty mow left behind.
It was a mass effort, a cleanup effort to help a lot of the residents in that area who were majority elderly and couldn't possibly move the wet sandbags from their yards. So we would set up large lines of students who would then move bags down the line and get rid of them.
You have these wonderful people who just show up, and people of all ages and families who helped us. And that just gives you such great sense of really of humanity.
By December of 2011, the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center was back open. The Y in South Sioux welcomed back its members, and repairs were underway to homes along the river.
They were so appreciative because there was no way that they were going to be able to get the immense, heavy, weighed down, water-logged sandbags out of there. So the appreciation for the efforts was overwhelming.
Located along the banks of the Missouri in South Sioux City, the Norm Waite Senior YMCA packed up everything for the flood. They removed carpeting, doors, equipment, and everything they could out of the building. Then hundreds of volunteers and staff spent days sandbagging the facility with the hopes of keeping the water out. The boat dock on one side and a public campground on the other, there was no telling just where the water would go.
And then as the water started coming in, most of it rerouted to the dock that's on the side of our building. So when the waters rose, it kind of all went that way and kind of went behind our building. So a lot of our damage kind of came into the parking lots, in the concrete, in the sidewalk.
Luckily, the building was not damaged, but they had to find a fix to get people back into the building after they returned that fall. That fix, a bridge of sand from the parking lot to the front door. It's hard to believe that it's been 10 years since the Great Flood of 2011.
As we look at the way we develop today, things are different because of that, and that's been helpful.
When we return, we hear from local residents one final time to see what has changed over the last 10 years. Stay with us. After the flood ended, $2 billion worth of damage had been done. 4,000 homes along the Missouri were destroyed and 5 people were killed. Now, as we look back on the last 10 years, a lot has changed here in Siouxland. Joining us once again, meteorologist Vivian Rennie with a look at how these residents and businesses have grown since the summer of 2011.
A decade and several smaller floods later, the flood of 2011 still sits in Siouxlanders' minds as a mark on our city, shaping how we move forward.
The operation of the river is kind of looked at with 2011 in mind.
The Dunes has shifted new projects and fixes to withstand the same conditions experienced in the summer of 2011.
But whenever we do anything out here, we think about impacts the river might have. You look out at the river now and it's at a reasonable level, but when we develop new things now, we always think of, well, what happens when the river's high and how do we mitigate those effects?
New developments are built higher up and a levee system has been created to keep the golf course safe.
As we look at the way we develop today, things are different because of that, and that's been helpful.
Just up the river in the Whinstone community, the flood of 2011 is being documented, even now in 2021.
We're trying to put a little more science into it and have a playbook. We're working actually with a local company right now to formalize that.
Engineers have worked with the community to assess the 2011 flood, what measures worked and what didn't.
Another generation or people that are running that community can have a document they can go to and it says, when the water's here, you might want to be doing this, and probably not that.
Down the river in the connection between the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center and the Betty Strong Encounter Center, there is a permanent reminder of the Great Flood of 2011.
We got stories to tell. We've got things to learn.
A hallway dedicated to the mighty mow and the flood that changed so many lives 10 years ago.
We wanted a record of what had happened. And out of that, we created an exhibit.
That exhibit stands as a nod to the summer of 2011 and the power of the Missouri River in Siouxland.
While the Missouri River has reached flood levels several times since 2011, none have come close to reaching the level of destruction as it did 10 years ago.
The Missouri has quite the history, acting as a jumping-off point for many trails that opened up to the American West, including the Oregon Trail and the Pony Express. Today, a 100-mile national park called the Missouri River National Recreation runs between the Gavins Point Dam and Ponca State Park and remains the last significant stretch of free-flowing river today.
We want to take a moment to thank you for joining us for this special Siouxland News presentation. If you missed any part of this program, want to watch it again, or read more about the Great Flood of 2011, visit our website, SiouxlandNews.com, or visit our YouTube page. Just search for Siouxland News.
Thanks for joining us, and have a great night.